Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Normally people are scared to give me a mic because I might just start singing, and I can't really sing. I prepared a little bit of an introduction for Clem. We all know him very well, but I was just listening to his stories, and I think what makes Clem special is that he's a relatable person. We can see that he's a human being and has been around the world. We can see that we can have fun with him. He was just telling me that he opened for the Rolling Stones, or actually played with them, and Keith thought that he was very good, but he needed a bit more edge. So today Clem is still working as hard as he always has. Clem started with Anglo American back in the 1970s. He managed the gold division for Anglo American and grew it back in the 70s to the largest gold company in the world, gold producing company in the world. You can imagine that during those times it was quite hard. 70s were quite turbulent for South Africa. He also then pioneered the futurist development of the futurist culture, I suppose, and set up a division within Anglo American to think about strategies how to traverse the world. During the 1990s, he set up two scenarios for South Africa. One, the high road, where there's a negotiated settlement, and then the other, the low road, where we have effectively a civil war. Fortunately, we followed the high road. So I think Clem is extremely well placed at this intersection of our country to give us some directions, to wave some of the flags. Some of the flags that he's highlighted have become very prominent, the religious problems, the religious conflict that we have around the world. So without further ado, Dr. Clem Sunter, he also has an honorary doctorate from the University of Cape Town.
Thanks, Ray. Good morning, everybody, and what a pleasure it is to be here. Privileged to talk for Personal Trust. And there is something slightly ironic in terms of talking about the future in a club that reminds one of the past. But there we go. I want to do three things today. I want to talk about the methodology, which I've used since the 80s to look at the future, because it is slightly different to the sort of classic method of forecasting. I would then like to talk about the global flags and global scenarios, because there's a lot going on around the world at the moment. And then I'd like to talk about South Africa, and particularly the scenarios after the election is over. I was introduced to scenario planning in the early 1980s. We as Anglo-American had a dreadful experience with our forecasting of gold prices and diamond demand and other things in the 70s. And we were looking around for some other technique, and we heard that Royal Dutch Shell in London had actually captured both oil price shocks in the 1970s. In the early 70s, it went from $3 to $12 a barrel, and at the end, from $12 to around $40 a barrel. And they'd capture them in scenarios. And it just so happened that the head of their scenario team was retiring in the early 80s. His name is Pierre Wack. Well, he's dead now, unfortunately, but his name was Pierre Wack. He was a Frenchman, very, very clever. And we asked him out to Johannesburg to address our executive committee. And I happened to be the secretary of the committee at the time. And he gave this bewitching presentation to the executive, and Gavin Relly, who was chairman of the company at the time, looked around the room, and his eyes alighted on me, and he said, "Clem, you wouldn't mind, in addition to your normal mining responsibilities, to take on scenario planning as well?" So I said, "Of course." And away we went, and I had this marvelous experience of working with some of the best futurists in the world, because Pierre had his own circle of remarkable people that he used to network his ideas about the future. And Pierre said a few memorable things to me. The first one was, don't ever let emotion get in the way of looking at the future. And indeed, there was a Scottish philosopher called David Hume, who in the 18th century said, reason is the slave of passion, not the other way around. And it so often dominates the way we think. And he said, actually, as a scenario planner, you've got to be totally objective and just look at the evidence in a very cold, rational way when you're thinking about the future. The second thing he said is, it's much better to be vaguely right than precisely wrong. And so his methodology was about precisely that, that it was to look at different futures and look at the flags and give probabilities to them rather than betting all the money on a single forecast of the future. And then the third thing he pointed out was that scenario planning was not about being the Delphic oracle where you gave a 360-degree picture of the future so that you could never be proved wrong. He said, actually, you've got to first look at the forces that are driving the present into the future, which I now call the flags. And he said, when you've looked at those forces, you'll have reduced the cone of uncertainty because obviously you can't write scenarios that are in conflict with those forces. And then you kind of do the possible future work. But you've got to establish those driving forces first. And he put huge emphasis on that particular step in the scenario process. So the kind of way we used it in Anglo was pretty good, but we did the high road, low road scenarios for South Africa, and it did show that you can think the unthinkable, because in the mid-80s, when I was going around South Africa talking about the high road, low road, many people said, why is Anglo wasting its money on you going around telling a fairy story, because there's absolutely no way the National Party government is going to sit down with the ANC and negotiate with the future, which is exactly what they did. But you wouldn't have forecast that, but you could capture it in a scenario. After Pierre retired, I'm afraid to say the process dropped away in our company, but I was sent a thesis in 2000 by a young student at UCT Graduate School of Business. Her name is Chantal Ilbury, and it was how scenario planning could be applied by entrepreneurs in small business. And it was such a good read that I said to her, we must collaborate on a book together, which we did, and we produced it in July 2001, and we called it The Mind of a Fox. And the reason was that there was a Greek poet called Archilochus who in 650 BC wrote the following line: the hedgehog knows one big thing, whereas the fox knows many little things. And we just thought this was a very good metaphor for contrasting scenario planning with sort of the classic forecasting tool. And when it first came out in July 2001, it wasn't that well received, but then something happened which turned it into an overnight hit. It was the #1 selling book of any title in South Africa in 2002, and in 2003 it was #2 because Harry Potter was #1. And for the reason I'm going to give you, the Mind of a Fox website actually became the top strategic website in the US for a short time. We were told by Google that it was very unusual for a foreign website to actually top the US charts in any particular category. So what happened? Well, it was 9/11 that propelled us into universal popularity, because in the book we decided, in order to show how our technique worked, we wrote a letter to George Bush in which we said, "Dear Mr. President, if you want to have a successful presidency, you've got to think like a fox. And right now, your biggest threat is a massive terrorist strike on a Western city, which will completely overturn your presidency. And it happened 3 months after we published the book. And when the American authorities did a literature search, they found that ours was the only book published anywhere in the world that in a direct letter to the president warned him of this. Why do I know this? Is because I was rung up by the US State Department about 6 months after 9/11. Obviously, I was a person of interest. And they said it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous that two South Africans can capture a scenario that the American intelligence agencies, hadn't done. And I said, well, we didn't know it was going to happen on that day. We didn't know it was going to happen in New York, and it was going to involve planes flying into buildings. That's a level of detail we couldn't come up with. But the general threat of an attack caused for religious reasons, what I will talk about a bit later, the religious flag, was rising, because we had 3 subsidiary flags. The first one was the growing competition between the major religions of the world in the late 80s and early 90s, between fundamental Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. The second flag was the growing sophistication of terrorist movements in both their strategy and tactics during the 90s. But the third flag was very specific. It was the 2 attacks by Al-Qaeda on embassies in Africa, in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, which we felt was a dress rehearsal for the real thing. And that's why we'd raised the threat level. And indeed, after 9/11, there was a congressional inquiry into it, and one of the people who testified was a young woman who said that she'd warned her boss on 6 occasions that there was a flying school down the road where 2 Arab pilots were learning to take off but not land. and they were part of the team that actually were involved in 9/11. So we couldn't have had our methodology more dramatically proved than by that particular incident. And since then, we've been doing stuff all around the world using this process of looking at the flags and then defining the scenarios that come out of the flags and giving intuitive probabilities to the scenarios. And it's still very popular. Indeed, my co-author, Chantel, now lives in the UK, and she and her son are working in Doha at the moment because the rulers of Dubai have said that they want to use the methodology to build up an image of what Dubai could look like in the 2030s. So, yeah, I'd like to go through those flags. One other point is that probably the most popular author in America on futurism is Philip Tetlock. He's written a book called Super Forecasting. Well into this century he wrote the book, and he used the metaphor that we used, foxes and hedgehogs. And basically he did some research which showed that forecasters who adapt their forecast as the future unfolds are much better at capturing the future than people who just hold on to one forecast that he called the hedgehogs. So we feel quite good that probably America's most popular futurist has used the same metaphor that we used. So what are the flags? Well, the first one is the religious flag. It's still high. It's been there since, as I said, 1988. And occasionally the threat level rises. And in July last year, and this is a bit of a coincidence, I wrote an article for News 24. You can read it on the News 24 website if you put my name into News 24. The first flag that I referred to in the article and gave the most prominence to was the religious flag, and said that it could lead to a 9/11 type of event in Israel. And that happened 3 months after after I'd actually published the article. And the 2 subsidiary flags that made me elevate the threat level of the flag was, firstly, that Israel was incredibly divided in the middle of last year by Benjamin Netanyahu's desire to weaken the judiciary system in Israel, and there have been a lot of public protests around that. And the second was that settlers were still taking land in the West Bank, which was causing a lot of fury amongst Palestinians. And so, yeah, obviously I didn't know that something was going to happen within, 3 months again, like 9/11, but it certainly happened. And again, it just shows that you can't let emotion sort of screen you from cold reality, because there was a woman, according to the New York Times, in Mossad called V, who wrote a scenario called Jericho Wall. And in that scenario, there was a major invasion of Israel by Hamas. And about 3 months before it happened, she said the drilling patterns of Hamas have changed, which would suggest that this scenario is becoming more probable. And it was dismissed by her boss. He said it's not a creditable scenario, because obviously he felt that Hamas didn't have the competency to mount that kind of attack. But in addition to that, there were young female conscripts around Gaza whose whole job was to watch what Hamas was doing there. And again, they reported to their bosses that the drilling patterns had changed, and again, they were ignored. So you kind of say, wow, here you have, probably some of the smartest people in intelligence in the world there, and they didn't pick up on the sort of direct evidence that they were given by people on the ground. And that's one of the most important things about being a fox, is on a daily basis to kind of look at the evidence around the flags to see how it's changing. They act as a kind of network through which you can look at articles on the internet and everything else to see whether you have to change your judgment about the flags. So the religious flag is very cloudy. We don't know, because I talked to Chantal about it, where this war in Israel is going, but it's a very uncomfortable one, because it doesn't just involve Hamas, it involves Hezbollah, it involves Iran. There was a short exchange between the two countries. And one doesn't know how a solution can be found, even the two-state solution, which will kind of bring a whole spirit of calm to the region. I mean, my wife and I toured Israel. It's a very small country. And I remember our guide saying to us, we can only lose the war once. And so there is a kind of feeling of insecurity, which has been there probably since Israel was established. And of course, right now, it's a kind of terrible life for people in Israel, but we all know about the hardship that Palestinians are suffering in Gaza as well. But we'll just have to wait and see how this particular flag plays out. The second flag is the leadership flag. And I added that to the list recently because I realize now that world leaders play a huge role in determining one's life, whether you live in the same country or you live somewhere else. I think of my father, who was going up the sort of ranks of Midland Bank in London during the 1930s, and suddenly he was drafted into the British Army in 1939, fought his way through the war, thank heavens he survived, and then was demobbed in 1945 and became a stockbroker. But his life was totally disrupted by a young man in Germany called Adolf Hitler. And that's the way it is. On a positive note, we had three leaders in the late 1980s, in Maggie Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and Mikhail Gorbachev, who actually established a positive relationship with one another. And they changed the world in the sense that they got rid of the Cold War and the Soviet Union disappeared. So you can have positive and negative global leaders. Right now, I'm afraid to say I'm pretty negative about this particular flag. You have Joe Biden, who's so old he wouldn't even get into Helderberg Village. And yeah, and he's going to serve another term if he gets in. I mean, it's absolutely nuts that you have the CEO of the military force, which is the biggest force in the world, heading into his mid to late 80s. Yeah, I mean, the only other person at the moment is Donald Trump. And if you ask me, I think the flags are going up that he might well go to prison on this Stormy Daniels trial. It's been interesting to watch that. And I'm just surprised that the mainstream networks in America, like CNN, haven't started exploring who else could possibly be a candidate, for the presidential election, because it takes time to appeal. And if the jury finds him guilty and the judge sentences him to jail, he'll probably go to jail until his appeal is heard. So yeah, it's a fascinating scenario. But we all know about Putin, another world leader. He's obviously a really nasty guy. We've had poisonings of his opponents, assassinations generally. Not a nice guy at all. And then you have Xi, who unfortunately is more of a Maoist than his predecessors, particularly Deng Xiaoping, who revolutionized the Chinese economy. It's such a shame that we've gone backwards in China. And Putin is about to meet Xi, and hopefully Xi is going to cool him down yet again on nuclear rhetoric, using nuclear weapons, because China has made a big point that Russia should steer away from using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. But, they don't have a really positive relationship with one another, and we'll have to wait for the next generation of leaders. And they may be completely different. And I think that one of the nations that is going to enter that sort of global leadership circle is India, which could become the biggest economy in the world in the second half of this century. But it's again cloudy because we don't know who the next generation of leaders will be. The third flag is, I call it the red flag of Russia, China, and North Korea. In the case of Russia, I wrote 10 pages in a book called Flag Watching, which was published in 2015. I wanted to show how the flags worked, and I devoted 10 pages to the Ukraine because Russia had annexed the Crimea, and I thought that this could ultimately lead to a third world war between America and Russia, because it was made clear at the time by Putin that he felt that NATO was extending itself eastwards to the border of Russia, and he felt that was a threat, and he didn't want Ukraine to be the next nation joining NATO. But equally, it was clear that NATO was proceeding to do just that, adopt other countries close to the Russian borders. And I don't actually put a huge probability on this scenario. I think that the sort of mad principle of mutually assured destruction, if you nuke me, I'll nuke you, still applies. And so even though a lot of people are now saying it's as big a threat to the world now as the Cuban Missile Crisis, I still think that that there's enough wisdom around amongst the leadership not to use nuclear weapons, because you would destroy Moscow, you would destroy Washington, you would destroy London overnight if you did. In terms of the other scenarios, I'm afraid that Russia at the moment is succeeding in Ukraine. And they have established themselves on the eastern front, and now they're moving in on villages around Kharkiv. And it seems that the tempo of the war has changed, and that's why the Americans have sent in a whole bunch of new weapons as a result of passing that $61 billion in Congress and getting presidential approval. But my worry is that even if Ukraine has enough weapons, it's going to run out of manpower. Russia simply has far more manpower than Ukraine. And so, at the moment, in terms of sort of conventional military campaign, I think the kind of Russian victory scenario has raised in probability, but there's always a possibility of negotiation. I know that Zelensky has said not a scrap of our land is going to be in Russian hands when we've finally got through, but we don't know. We just don't know whether he's going to negotiate or not. So you have to play these scenarios, you have to watch the press to see how it unfolds. The second country is China. China now is an absolute rival of America. I actually did a session in 2006 with the Chinese Communist Party at the Central Party School in Beijing because they wanted to understand how scenario planning works so that they could road test their 5-year economic plans. And what was really interesting at the sort of end of the morning was I asked them to actually name me what they thought the principal flag was in the near term. They wrote a scenario of an American recession, and they went into a huddle on the flag, which would indicate that an American recession, they didn't call it a crash, they called it a recession, would take place. And then they came up with the concept of property prices. They said the biggest asset of an American consumer is his or her house, and if they decline in value, then they won't spend as much. And since consumer spending is 2/3 of the American economy will start falling away. And interestingly, in the last quarter of 2006, because I kept in touch with them, the Case-Shiller index, which measures property prices in America, leveled off for the first time in 20 years. And in the first quarter of 2007, it actually fell. And so, the Central Party School were giving about an 80% probability to an American recession. And it happened later that year in September. And so it was a very good example of using the flags. And interestingly, it's a flag worth watching right now because American property prices have flattened out again in terms of looking at where the American economy can go. But China's real issue is Taiwan. They made it very clear to me that Taiwan is part of China. Of course, the Taiwanese don't want it that way, and it's a very crucial country for manufacturing computer chips and other things. And so again, it's a flag that you have to watch to see which way the wind will blow on that one. North Korea, you have a very unpredictable guy in Kim Jong-un. He has 50 nuclear weapons, and he suspended all ballistic missile tests back in Trump's time. I mean, they actually shook hands in a friendly fashion in the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. But he's started it up again. He's doing ballistic missile testing all the time, and some of those missiles are landing close to Japan. And so, again, it's a very cloudy flag, but it has to be watched because if he really starts getting serious, he could change the whole prospects for the Far East. The fourth flag is an interesting one because it's kind of been there, and it's a clockwork flag. It ticks away in the background, but very few people actually write about it. It's the grey flag of the aging of the world's population. And in 1988, Pierre Wack said to me, if Japan ever has a property crash, its economy will decline to virtually zero growth. And in the late 80s, we were all saying Japan is one of the wizards of the world that had 7 to 8% per annum economic growth in the 70s and 80s. And here was Pierre saying it's going to evaporate. So I said to him, why? And he said, well, he says, Japan is the oldest country in the world in terms of its population. It has the highest percentage of over 65-year-olds. And he says, old people don't spend as much. They don't do as much. They don't innovate as much. And he said, you know, Japan could easily fall away. And indeed, 1990, there was both a stock market crash and a property crash. And the Japanese economy has sort of averaged around 0.5% per annum economic growth since then. And yes, they're very happy. They've got very low unemployment. Their population is declining, so their per capita income hasn't fallen, it's risen. So it is a new model. But the same applies now to Europe. Europe is an aging entity, and particularly Italy and Greece. And in Italy's case, the population is declining, just like Japan's population is declining. But the one country for me, the future has changed dramatically recently is China. Because of the one-child policy, they're now a middle-aged country, and their population is starting to decline. It's down 1 to 2 million over the last 2 years, which isn't much on 1.3 billion people. But nevertheless, there is a book out which is called The Age of Decay. I can't remember the author, but he reckons that the Chinese population could fall to 700 million at the end of this century. So it really puts paid to fast economic growth rates for China for the rest of this century. Yes, you'll still have young populations in South America and Africa, but of course you need good government as well in order to have a high economic growth rate. America, interestingly, is still relatively young. And so its economy will grow sort of maybe at 3 to 4% per annum, whereas Europe will be down to sort of 1%, and the UK similarly. And you know, I've always said to people, you know, if you are going to invest overseas, do it in America rather than Europe. I mean, I just quote one statistic that the FTSE 100 on the last day of the last century was 6,950. It's now 8,400, which isn't bad. I mean, it's actually hitting record highs at the moment. But compared to America, which was 11,000, the Dow Jones Industrial Average at the end of the last century, and is now 38,000, more than tripled. It was much better to invest on average in America because of this particular flag. So again, it's something that one watches all the time. And one of the points made in The Age of Decay is that in the second half of this century, a lot of developed countries like Britain and America may have to import far more people to be essential workers to maintain all the infrastructure in those countries. The fifth flag is for me the most existential threat to the world. I call it the green flag of climate change. It first went up in 1989 when I co-authored a book with Brian Huntley and Roy Siegfried, two eminent South African environmentalists. And what they pointed out in the book was that it's not so much the gradual heating up of the world, but the greater frequency of extreme weather events that's going to happen in this century. And indeed, that's what we're seeing right now. There's a new term called atmospheric rivers, which is being used in California. It's where in the atmosphere now, the rainfall is not it's much more dense because, of course, the seawater is evaporating into the clouds. The clouds are hotter so that they can hold that seawater. But it's now getting channeled so that you have these incredible rivers that just explode over parts of California. Brazil has had this, right at this point in time. Afghanistan. And a lot of people say, oh no, but we've always had floods. Yeah, we have, but we haven't had the intensity that we're seeing now. And of course, on the other side, there are droughts in places like Zimbabwe and Zambia, which are equally intense, and in the middle of Spain as well. Has COP, the annual meeting on the environment, done anything about this? The answer is no. And of course, environmentalists are very worried about this because we only have one Earth. And so, you know, we're going to see more extreme events. And one of the points made to me by the people I keep in contact with on this flag, the one surprising thing is that they thought a lot of this was going to happen in the second half of this century, whereas it's happening right now. And indeed, we're about to go through the 1.5 degree centigrade threshold above pre-industrial times, and it could go up to even 2.5 degrees. So it's certainly a flag that has to be watched because, you know, people are more interested at the moment in conflict and, you know, Israel and Ukraine. They've knocked this kind of flag off the news, but it's absolutely there, and it affects all of us. The next flag is the anti-establishment flag that is going up around the world for two reasons. Social media, where people can, you know, go and choose who they listen to. And so there are more people becoming polarized by social media, and particularly extreme social media. But equally, the inequality of income around the world has risen since 2007, 2008. I mean, the super rich are back to being super rich, in fact, even much richer than they were in 2007-8. But your average middle class, working class person is no better off in real terms if you allow for inflation than they were in 2007. In fact, there was a recent article on British nurses which showed that they actually earn less in real terms now than they did in 2006. So there's a lot of anger now in electorates around the world, and that has led to extreme right-wing, extreme left-wing parties, and one must obviously watch this particular dynamic. The porous border flag was first raised at a meeting I facilitated in Paris for Interpol. We had the police chiefs from around the world, and we were looking at the 10 biggest threats to the world over the next 10 years. And to my surprise, they nominated a flag which was nothing to do with crime in the conventional sense of drugs or guns. They called it porous borders. They said that essentially the West doesn't have the defense systems against illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, and this is going to become the biggest issue over the next 10 years. Well, they've been proved right. I mean, it's unbelievable that, you know, this whole thing of the British Channel crossings and now trying to send people to Rwanda, and now Northern Ireland has said that's unconstitutional to do that. And so there's a huge row going on in Britain about it. But equally in America, there's a lot of stuff going on the border between America and Central America, and nobody knows whether to build more walls or what to do about it. But as a lot of people have said, if climate change, the green flag, really gets desperate, you're going to have not millions, but tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of immigrants seeking shelter from climate change elsewhere in the world. So again, it's a flag that we have to watch. The debt flag is important because all that easy money that was handed out by governments to get us back from the crash, the financial crash of 2008, with virtually zero interest rates. And then, of course, the pandemic meant a lot of handouts to businesses to keep going during the pandemic. We now have national debt figures which are staggering. I mean, America, national debt right now is $34 trillion. $34 trillion. Its GDP, gross domestic product, is 28 trillion. And so the debt is 125% of GDP. And in the last century, The recommended ceiling for national debt as a percentage of GDP was 60%. So American debt is more than double the recommended ceiling of the last century. And the UK is around about 100%. And yeah, I have to say the markets are completely ignoring this flag. They're hitting record highs, and they obviously feel that there will be a perfectly reasonable outcome to this, with interest rates coming down, and it will be affordable. But again, it is a flag to be watched because, as we know, the subprime mortgage situation in 2008, when people couldn't pay their mortgages, is what triggered the financial crash of that year. The pandemic flag should always be on our radar system. It was in our case before the pandemic struck, but we didn't have the kind of international shutdown scenario. We just didn't know that it would lead to that. So it really showed just how horrendous a virus can be in terms of economic consequences. But there could be other viruses around, or it could be a new variant of COVID. Nobody knows, but again, you just have to check out that particular flag, by watching the news. The crowded space flag, no legislation has been made about space since 1967, when the UN said that generally space was free. And now, of course, we have all the satellites, we have all the rockets, and we have the Chinese landing rockets on the moon to dig up rock. And yeah, there's no legislation, and there's a possibility of a collision in space causing fragments to do serious damage to the international banking system or international communication system. So again, a flag to be watched, particularly in terms of maybe new legislation to try and make things more orderly in space. And the last flag is on all our minds, artificial intelligence. Every 60 years you have a new technology which changes the world. And right now it's artificial intelligence. And of course people write articles about the good things that it can do, which is allowing people access to far more data than they used to have by asking the right questions. But equally there's the downside of people being able to hack your passwords and hack into systems around the world using AI. And indeed, one of the kind of new developments in the Ukrainian war is that Russia is hacking the GPS systems on Finnish aeroplanes. And so they've moved into that kind of electronic kind of conflict. And yeah, it's something that has to be watched. So what are the two mainframe global scenarios that we develop out of the flags? The first one we call Friendly Planet, which is where we do find endings to both the wars in Ukraine and Israel. Probably there will be a new generation of leaders. We will put climate change as a priority and do real things to reduce emissions. Yes, we've got electric cars, but what people are finding is that electric cars at the moment are very expensive, particularly when your battery has to be renewed, and also, of course, with the charging points available around the countries. So there's a lot more to be done in order to be serious about climate change, but that happens in the Friendly Planet scenario. The alternative is called Gilded Cage. It's where the West retire into a gilded cage. They build a kind of the bars as closely as possible so that illegal immigrants can't get in, and they live inside the cage, and as long as the rest of the world doesn't threaten the cage, the rest of the world just kind of exists out there. And yeah, it's led to BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and now more nations have joined BRICS. So there is things happening outside the cage, but it's a polarized world. It's not as bad as the 1930s, but it's certainly a lot worse than it was in the 70s and 80s and 90s when you had globalization and free movement of goods and people. And it's a much tougher global economy as a result of the Gilded Cage. And I noticed that Biden has just increased tariffs on yet more Chinese products in America. So, it is interesting that despite this polarized world of the Gilded Cage, markets are still hitting record highs. The South African flags, we have 6. The first one is an obvious one to all of you in this room, the crime and corruption flag. And I think it's better than it was under the previous president and the Guptas. We're doing better, but we've got a long way to go in order to bring that flag down the mast. And particularly it is important because we looked at countries around the world with high economic growth rates. And on the whole, you've got to have clean government and obviously a clean private sector. And nobody's totally clean, but you aim to do that. So it's a very important flag. The quality of infrastructure flag, we all know about because of the Eskom situation. It not only applies to electricity supply, but railways and ports and education and healthcare. And we all know that Cyril is signing the National Healthcare Act. And it's got to be done. It's got to be done properly. And obviously, it's got to have absolutely no crime and corruption associated with it if it is to work. The third flag is the entrepreneurship flag. Work has changed. In the last century, big business created hundreds of thousands of jobs. But with automation and robots and different ways of doing business, the major creator of jobs now in the world is small business and the informal sector. The latest statistic in America is that two-thirds of American jobs created every month are in the small business sector. And that's why they have such a low unemployment rate. It's below 4%. It's because in most small towns in America, you have the shopkeepers who probably do other jobs. You have family businesses. That's what basically keeps America going. So if we want to have a 3 to 5% growth per annum economy in South Africa, we're going to have to do far more for small business. Maybe e-stock exchanges in all the major cities where you can promote your business on the site to attract crowdfunding. We've got to do everything to cut the red tape on small business in this country. We've got to integrate the township economies with the mainstream economy so that young black entrepreneurs can make it into the mainstream economy, and if they're really good, they can go international as well. The 2024 election flag is obviously right in front of us, and I watch obviously the kind of polls as much as anybody else. There is a chance that the ANC will fall into the 40s. Obviously, at the high 40s, they can do a deal with a small minority party, but in the low 40s, obviously, it would be a deal with either the EFF or the DA. But I have to say, recently, there have been pollsters saying that the ANC might well get over the 50%. That cannot be ruled out. And it's a cloudy flag because none of us will know until election day is over. But it's very important because it's 30 years of the new South Africa, and we've moved on to the economic challenges. And I remember in our scenario team in the 1980s, the Anglo team, that there were two crossroads, the political crossroads, which we managed to reconnoiter in the early 90s, but they always said there's an economic crossroads later on in the next century where if we don't get it right, we will undo all the good work that we did by taking the right road politically. And that's exactly where we are now. We've actually got to transform this economy into a more entrepreneurial economy. The neutrality flag in a highly polarized world is important because we want to keep our export markets open in America, in the UK, as well as obviously China and other countries. But this requires a kind of, a really, really balancing act, as we saw with the Lady R in Simonstown and the controversy that was a cause that it could be carrying weapons to Russia. And now, of course, with the International Criminal Court of Justice, with South Africa putting the case of genocide to the court, this has meant that we've got to be very careful that we don't lose the markets that we've got for our exports, because it would be an absolute tragedy to do so. And the last flag is again a very obvious one around land and food security. We all know that food security is becoming a big issue. Apparently, something like 70% of the Zimbabwe crop has been destroyed by the drought. Here in South Africa, we still have a situation where the food producers are producing, but it means that you've got to have a very careful balancing act between obviously spreading the ownership of land in this country, but maintaining food security here. So what are the scenarios that flow out of these 6 flags? I'd like to quote from a meeting I had last week of the Anglo Advisory Panel in South Africa, where we had a brilliant presentation from the Inlula Miti Institute. They're a private research organization, privately funded, and they've been doing scenarios since 2017. And I asked them, after I'd listened to the presentation, whether I could use their scenarios because they were so good, and they said, please do. The first scenario that, and I must mention that Inlula Miti means giraffe in Nguni, so that you can look over the trees at the horizon to see what might be lying there. The first scenario they call Hardida blah blah. And it's such a wonderful name for a scenario. It's memorable because, as we know, hardidars make a lot of noise whilst they're flying, but not much else. And so it is a classic scenario for South Africa, that you have the politicians saying they're going to do this, they're going to create a better life for all, and all that kind of stuff, but it just doesn't materialize in action. And so it's a scenario where we've had for quite some time. The second scenario they called vulture culture. It's where the vultures, the gangsters, silently take money out of the system. We become a gangster state, and there are plenty of South American countries that have gone that way. It's not a good scenario at all, and of course it can lead South Africa ultimately to a failed state or a wasteland, and that's why the crime and punishment flag is and corruption flag is just so important. And the third scenario, which is the positive one, they called Weaver's Nest. Weavers are small birds. They take the twigs, the grass, the leaves, and they put it all together in magnificent nests. And as they said, there are a lot of examples of the Weaver's Nest scenario at the moment in South Africa. You go to a shopping mall, you go to a restaurant, people work in teams together. There's no sort of thing about color or anything in the teams. They're there to produce a product for the customers, whether it's a restaurant or whether it's selling goods to people in a major supermarket. They're working together, and it does show that this model of working together is already exists in South Africa, but we've got to do so much more to sort of build on it. So the Weaver's Nest scenario is very much a ground-up revolution rather than top-down. And it would mean, for example, that the president would actually ask some renowned entrepreneurs to join him in a panel, just like he had doctors during the pandemic, to advise him on what the best steps to free up our economy could be in order to help the entrepreneurs. I did a debate with Julius Malema back in 2016 at the Cape Sun in the evening. And one of the points I made to Julius was, I'm as much of an economic freedom fighter as you are, Julius. It's just that my definition of economic freedom is different to yours. You want to nationalize the land, the banks, the mines. I want to create far more individual economic freedom for all those aspiring entrepreneurs in the country. And there are plenty of them, I can assure you, around in the townships, but also in a lot of the small towns and villages elsewhere in South Africa. So those are the three scenarios: the hardy-da, blah, blah, the vulture culture, or the Weaver's Nest. And we will have to wait and see for the outcome of the election in order to decide which scenario has the highest probability. So I hope I've given you a methodology that you can use in a personal situation, because it applies to companies, it applies to families. You've got to consider the flags, and then obviously the scenarios that flow out of the flags, and then you've got to take action based on the probabilities. It's a very useful technique to use privately, as well as obviously to look at the world as a whole and South Africa. I've shown you the global situation, which is pretty tough at the moment, and I hope I've given you an idea of the kind of different scenarios there are for South Africa. And I'd like to end with a benediction for all of you in this room. May the fox be with you. Thank you.